Myself and Norman, our business partners, we founded this business 5 years ago. We started in 2010. I'm very pleased to say that this year we've finally made the top 100 on one of the industry lists that will be published in a couple of weeks. We call ourselves a full-service digital agency, and we provide services end-to-end from concept through to implementation and support thereafter. But rather than talking about being full-service like most of the other agencies here, our particular forte, like we've said, is web content management systems and the complex back-end integrations with various CRMs, ERP solutions, and so on. Over the past 5 years, we've acquired in excess of 40 clients. We work for a lot of top 100 digital agencies in the background as a white labeled implementation partner. So again, when it comes to web content management, being taken beyond the out-of-the-box functionality, we're usually called in by a lot of agencies. We have a team of around 40 employees spread across 2 countries and currently 3 offices. We have our engineering team in Southern Europe, which allows us to be a little bit more competitive by applying what we call a best your model. And we also have development project management teams in the UK headed out of Maidenhead. Currently, we are Kentico and Sycor certified partners. Even though we've worked across many different technologies, periodically as an expert, we like to do a review of where the vendors are and where the technology is going, and we feel that we need to partner with the most advanced and suitable technologies in terms of where they fit within the space. So, for example, the reason why we've chosen Sycor is because we feel out of all the CMSs out there at the moment for enterprise-level websites, we feel that Sycor is by far the most scalable and best positioned solution at the moment. And for any SME requirements or anything that's not quite enterprise, we would say that Kentico is currently the strongest player. And we'll talk about why we think that, and a few more things around that a little bit later. And just before I hand off to Norman, a little bit of our background, but like I mentioned, we founded this business 5 years ago, but prior to that, we've got a history in web content management from a vendor's perspective. So we've, for many years, worked selling web content management solutions, but also assisting clients in buying web content management solutions. So that's why we feel like we've got insight from both sides that we can share with you today. Norman's actually the brains behind the operation. I just do a little bit of talking from time to time and take credit for his work. So when he starts talking, you'll actually find it a lot more interesting. But he's got over 40 years experience. You wouldn't think it to look at him, I know. But out of that 40 years, I believe around 15 years is in web content management. And prior to that, it's been a number of technological roles. I've been in the industry for about 12 years. 5 years of that has been running my own business. 4 years prior to that, I was heading up a global CMS vendor and managing the Europe, Middle East and Africa regions. And before that, I did a variety of quite geeky roles in a number of companies. I started out as a developer and worked my way around. So before we get into any further, I'd like Norman to just tell you a little bit about the history of the CMS space that's going to create a nice context for everything else that we talk about thereafter. So I'm going to hand over to Norman briefly.
So the early content management systems, does this thing not work? Should be. Yeah, early content management systems really evolved out of print-based and document management systems, simply because they had the right technology. At the time, which is in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, there were languages like SGML emerging to describe documents, and they were a very close match to HTML, which was emerging for website, web pages. However, they're not really well suited to what a website really requires. They were based largely on storing a repository full of assets and then deploying those into a website which was effectively compiled into HTML. and they formed what are known as static web content management systems. Some of them are still around. So companies such as Broadvision, Interwoven, Vignette were building these systems, deploying them. Some, as I say, are still in use. Then around about 2001, 2002, there started to emerge a different type of content management system, what's known as a dynamic web content management system, and that was allowed to happen, or that enabling technology behind that was the emergence of what are known as online WYSIWYG editors. So the ability to edit content in a web browser and deploy it into a database which could then feed into a website was the technology that underlies most modern content management systems. And we see that in around about the 2000s, early 2000s, companies like Ectron, Sitecore, Episerver, all starting to come into the market. Drupal, Telerik, which started building WYSIWYG editing components. WordPress was established around that time, and these are all this second generation content management system. Since that time, since about the mid-2000s, what we've seen is a process of rationalization. I remember going to CeBIT in 2003, and there were 600 German content management systems, just German ones, never mind other ones. And what we've seen since then is a process of rationalization, and this is a sort of an inevitable consequence among emerging industries, that they have to get the costs down. And one way of doing that is to productize, particularly in the software space. So instead of bespoke systems where you would go and commission a content management system, what started to happen in the early to mid-2000s was that companies started to put together standard feature sets, started to create what we now regard as the modern content management system. So that takes us up to say 2010, and since then we'll see that what's happened is that content management companies have tended to try and enhance their product offering.
So the point of all of that is that there are currently in excess of 2,000 web content management systems out there. Can I just ask, as a show of hands, who here uses a web content management system for their job? And okay, so that's about more than half, I would say. And who has been involved in a... Norman, you need to leave. And who's been involved in the process of buying a CMS or selecting a CMS? Okay, so we've got one person at the back. Okay, there's a couple of shy people. I'm sure there's more in here. The point is that we're trying to make is when you set out to select a CMS, a lot of people take the wrong approach. So a lot of people go and look at web content management systems, fall for the sales tactics of a particular vendor, go for that system, and then figure out how to achieve what they need to achieve with that system. The important thing is one size does not fit all. Out of those 2,000, chances are there's only a handful that will be suitable for what your need is. So how do you go about filtering from the massive list to actually getting into a selection process where you're having dialogue and so on? This is a slide that just is meant to suggest confusion. It confused me when I saw it in my presentation. Just to kind of summarize, this is a typical process that organizations in our experience would go through or should go through when selecting a CMS. And there's a few variants in here dependent on a number of factors. But the first element is to validate the business need. And what that means is, do you really need a web content management system? Very often people go out and buy a web content management system because it's the done thing, because the competitors have it, because they saw a great presentation at a digital marketing show and we're convinced. But the truth is, a lot of the time, businesses already have technology and capability to achieve a lot of that without going out to buying a new CMS. Having sold many CMS in my life, I can think of at least 10 companies that have an enterprise CMS currently that they don't even know they've got it, because the people that bought it have left and moved on, and it just gets lost within the organization somewhere. So that's do you even need a system? Once you understand that you need a system, then it's a case of understanding stakeholders and business requirements. So again, rather than looking at a system and determining what you're going to do based on the system's capabilities, you need to forget about the system and ask yourself a very open question: what do you want your website to do, and how do you want your users to manage that website? So understanding what the business needs from this investment, independent of what technologies are available, is the first thing that marketers and stakeholders should do. That's not me, So once you understand the business requirements, we would then go through a process of translating that into functional requirements. So, for example, one business requirement might be we need more sales through the website. That will get broken down into a number of functional requirements, one of which will be we need e-commerce functionality on the website, we need the ability to manage transaction, make sales, and so on. So you would break that list into a much deeper functional list. And at that point, you would then be in a position where you can start the process of shortlisting vendors. Now, there's some things that are going to do a big part of the shortlisting for you at the very outset, and those are things like budget. If you've only got £100,000 for a new website, there's no point looking at CMSs that are going to cost you £90,000 because you don't have enough to complete your project. There's other things like IT policy. Some in companies, IT departments usually go down a licensed Microsoft .NET route where everything has to be on Microsoft, or they go down an open source route. That alone will roughly half the possible vendors that you can potentially work with. And then once you know the requirements, the idea is to find a handful of suitable vendors that you would engage in dialogue with at that point. And the questions at that sort of stage are, all the CMS are going to have a lot of commonality, but the way in which they're going to do what you need it to do is going to vary. So that's when you look at things in a little bit more detail. These two next steps can vary, and what I would say here is that in certain situations, we typically work with marketer teams predominantly, and if this is something that's being driven by marketers from the outset, and an organisation does not have technical capability or knowledge or a big IT department internally, then you need to make sure that you've got the right implementation partner and the right agency to support you through your selection process as well as thereafter, before you actually start talking to CMS vendors. In cases where you've got an IT department and you've got policies and IT have to be involved, that sometimes is justification for an organisation to go and select a CMS and then bring in the right partner after they've made a choice about what CMS they want to work with. But that really depends on what capability you have internally. The point all that we're trying to make is that you need to be informed, and you need to have technically minded people and expertise help you contact the vendors and have the right communications. And then thereafter you'd carry out a proposal, go through proof of concept, and start the procurement process once you've found the right vendor. Now, most TMSs, traditionally, web content management is about how do you manage the content on a website. So I'd say most of content management functionality, 90+% of CMS solutions have. So they're the basics. There's no point really focusing on them because they're the basic features that every CMS will deliver. So what you really want to talk about or look at is the differentiators. So what are the more advanced features that differentiate certain CMS platforms from others are? Some of the kind of key things that we find is, content management systems trying to position themselves much more as marketing automation tools and really kind of a central piece of technology that's going to not only help you build your website but manage your entire digital strategy thereafter in the next year and many years to come. The other thing that's important to point out, having been involved in probably 400 or 500 CMS procurements and projects, I've never seen a scenario where a client uses more than about 20% of the functionality that they actually purchase. So CMS solutions are always going to have a lot of functionality that you don't need, that you're never going to use. So it's important not to focus on that functionality or pay additionally for that functionality. One very clear decision that I've also mentioned is whether you go open source and licensed, and I just wanted to elaborate on that slightly, but again, this is a business decision that needs to be made before you even get into dialogue with an agency or a particular vendor. And it's often is determined by IT, and there's a lot of pros and cons. The bottom line is, if you are a commercial business and your in our opinion, and your business is dependent on your website, and there's a criticality to that website being up and running continuously, then we would always categorically recommend that you go with some sort of a licensed CMS, because when there's a licensed CMS, you do need the people behind that technology to be available for you to almost pass problems on to, or to support you when your website goes down. And that's one of the downsides with open source solutions. No matter how good your agency is, you will sometimes get to a problem that nobody can fix, and you just hope that somebody out there in the open source community is going to fix that problem for you at some point. Okay, so at this point I'm going to briefly hand over to Norman again, and I'll reconvene shortly.
See if we can get this microphone to work again. So, Nedge mentioned that the core set of features of the CMS have sort of become fairly me too. We'd expect every CMS to have this core set of features. And what we've seen since about 2010 is the emergence among the CMS vendors of an attempt to try and differentiate themselves based on added value capabilities. And a lot of this resides around functions associated with marketing. So one of the most important things to bear in mind when you're dealing with CMS vendors is that software products have what's called zero marginal cost. So the cost to the CMS vendor of manufacturing another copy of his CMS to sell to you is zero. And that puts him in a unique position unlike, say, when you're building a car, where you've got the cost of the car and you've got to amortize that or recover that in the cost of the sale. With a CMS, there's no such consideration. So they're free to set the price wherever they want. And what the vendors do, therefore, is they try and balance what they anticipate in terms of numbers of unit sales against the amount of revenue per sale in order to maximize their revenue. So that's the name of the game that they're engaged in. What that means from your perspective as a purchaser is that you have leverage. You know that they can sell it for whatever they want to sell it for. It means they can afford to discount. It means that you can afford, or you can negotiate on price. Price is 100% negotiable.